I'm very excited to be here today to talk about a little bit about my research, about the concept of Bothorship, which is just a neologism that I threw together to help describe chatbot authorship, and talk a little bit about some of the ethics of scholarly publishing and also how I think AI will transform our ethics applied to scholarly publishing a bit as well. So let me start by talking a little bit just briefly about myself. So I'm an assistant professor of information science at the University of North Texas. We're located in Denton, Texas, which is about 30 minutes northwest of the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, if you're familiar with that. So we're in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area. Information science. I get a lot of questions about what is information science. I think it's germane to the topic I'm talking about today. So I'll just briefly describe what it is. So we emerged out of the field of library science. And so a lot of the early contributors to information science were librarians. And naturally, the focus of librarians is on connecting people, connecting our users, or the term we prefer to use is patrons, with the information resources they need. And so as we evolve and we kind of emerge out of just the library specific context, we are focused still on that human centered aspect. So, how does the evolution of information, the evolution of technology, impact people, society, and culture? So, obviously, very relevant in the modern age when we see information explosion, information overload, the emergence of new information technologies, new systems, and generative artificial intelligence. And so that is our area of expertise, our domain of expertise. I do frequently collaborate with researchers around the world. I like to focus a lot on collaborating with researchers from the global south or developing countries as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that within the context of my presentation today. And my LinkedIn and ResearchGate profiles are there if you are interested in reading a little bit more about me. So let me start today by just talking a little bit about the status of authorship to help set the scene for our discussion today. And so obviously, if you are in any kind of tenure track faculty position, clinical faculty position, even doctoral student, graduate student of any kind, writing and publishing is critical to tenure and promotion, to securing a job, to advancing in your career. However, it's really a pretty small component of everything you're asked to do as an academic professional. So in my week to week schedule, I'm asked to be on 3 university-wide committees, 3 departmental committees, search committee, 2 professional organization committees, leadership roles, and of course teach, which is very important because that's why we exist as institutions in the first place. But scholarly research and publishing tends to be the biggest criteria, particularly at research universities, in determining whether you're going to get tenure and promotion, even though recent research shows that we only dedicate or are able to dedicate about 15 to 25% of our time to this particular task. And so, I might work in an average week 60 to 70 hours. I'm only dedicating 20 hours of that to my research work, which is still insufficient to publish all the things I'd like to publish, make revisions to papers, and so on. And on top of that, we have to think of research as a very extended process where publication is just the end state, the end objective of this entire process. So we have to come up with an idea. If we're especially at a research university, we're going to seek funding for that research idea. So we're going to be submitting proposals, developing proposals. We're then going to have to design the study, assuming we are fortunate enough to get some kind of funding, design the study, go through an ethical review with our research board, then conduct the study, then publish. So of this 15 to 25%, how much time is actually spent on that publishing process is extremely minimal. And at my university, when we dedicate time to teaching, or when I dedicate time to teaching, I'm really invested in working closely with my students as well, providing them detailed, personalized feedback. So I'm not dedicating a lot of graduate assistant time to other tasks. So my time for writing becomes increasingly limited, as it is for many people. At the same time, looking at the landscape of publishing, academic publishing around the world, I did a study a couple of years ago with probably about 20 authors from a whole range of countries around the globe. And we were looking at journals in the Social Science Citation Index, so kind of the key index of top scholarly journals. And in this study, we found that about 90+% of academic journals indexed in the SSCI are published really in three countries: US, United Kingdom, and Netherlands. And 95% of these journals are published only in English. So, from the perspective of me as American whose native language is English, that's great. I mean, that's my language. Those are my countries. I'm familiar with that context. I'm familiar with how Americans write. But for researchers around the globe, and particularly in developing countries, the global south, there are additional barriers just to get to the level of publishing, the ability to publish that I'm at. Just to get to that level playing field, even, they've got to become proficient in a language that might not be their native language. I don't speak any language other than English, and that's perfectly fine for me within this academic context. But for many people, that's not the case. They're facing an additional barrier to just get to that point. If we look at this figure on the right here, we're looking at the number of articles published per million people living in a country as of 2020. And we can see the countries that are publishing the most articles per million people are countries where English is a predominant language. So we have North America, Northern Europe, Australia as countries that have the most publications, even though there are really robust and growing research ecosystems, particularly in China, India, Nigeria, I would say is a really emerging area. Iran, I have met so many collaborators in recent years from Iran who are wanting to publish, but in those countries, there are many barriers to publishing in top level academic journals, not because they don't have the same quality of ideas and perform the same quality of research as people from the United States, Northern Europe, Australia, because they certainly do. It is often a language barrier where they are putting together high quality studies that are very contextually relevant for their particular country as well, but they're getting published in very low quality journals because of the quality of the writing, because in many cases these are not native English speakers. Then we can look at this lower left figure here, which is taken from a study by Christensen. So in this study, it's looking at the major research collaboration networks worldwide. And again, we can see these networks highly favor the global north, particularly United States and Northern Europe. Back and forth collaborations between these countries. Additionally, many of the collaborations that exist outside of these two continents are collaborations between researchers who have left these continents to come to the United States or Northern Europe to seek higher education, and people back in their home country. So it's not like, for instance, people like me reaching out and collaborating with researchers from Iran or Nigeria or India. That type of collaboration still remains very limited. And so the point of bringing this all up is to point out the potential biases that exist in the academic publishing ecosystem and set the scene so I can talk a little bit about how I think AI can be beneficial for overcoming that, as well as mention some of the potential problems and pitfalls with AI for those purposes. So, bot authorship. I contend, it is my belief that generative AI can be very beneficial for improving the quality of written communications. But there's a very nuanced level of approach and understanding to how generative AI can be used for these purposes. So I am not by any means in favor of using generative AI to write an entire paper for you. And I think in most cases, if you did use generative AI to write an entire paper for you, it would be very noticeable. And ultimately, you're going to end up doing more work to make it look as though AI did not create this paper than it's actually worth. And so this figure to the right here is not based off of empirical evidence so much as just anecdotal evidence and observation from working with a lot of students who try to use generative AI to write and working with researchers who are interested in generative AI. But it is my belief that if you were to just feed a basic prompt into ChatGPT, for instance, and ask it to write you a paper on a topic, you're ultimately going to be, it might read well, but you're ultimately probably going to be doing more work to make it not read as though it's AI written, to add references, to validate references, than it's actually worth it to use those models. I think there's a sweet spot where we could use generative AI to level the playing field, help reduce, mitigate some of those issues I mentioned on the last slide, while improving outcomes for academics. And that sweet spot involves the researcher being involved in the creation of the research manuscript, of actually conducting the research, collecting the data, still being involved in all of those research processes, still writing the manuscript, but using a large language model as essentially a super-powered version of the tools we already use and believe are permissible in scholarly publishing, such as the tools embedded into Microsoft Word, Grammarly, those kinds of things. And so in those cases, the focus is primarily on feeding content we've already written, we've already put together into a model, and asking it to help revise, make it read better. Something I've done as a collaborator. So I've collaborated quite a bit with researchers, as I mentioned, from Iran, Nigeria, India. And a core component of what I'm doing, I am involved in the entire research process, but a major component of what I'm doing is just revising, rewriting the paper so it reads better. So essentially, it would be replacing a lot of my role with AI. But again, it still needs human collaboration. This is not replacing the human role in the publishing process, but understanding that AI can help level the playing field, help fill a gap that exists currently within the research ecosystem that I was studying and pointing out before any of these recent developments with generative AI came along. So as I said, I think generative AI can be a great tool for, in particular, non-native English speakers to enhance the accessibility of their writing and the understanding of their writing to a level where it can get published in these top academic journals. And that really would help create a more equitable environment for people from all diverse linguistic and geographic backgrounds. I showed some of the disparities before. I can also talk about anecdotally the researchers I've talked to and the struggles they've faced in getting published. I can talk about several of my collaborators from Iran who not only face these language gaps, but also face a lot of gaps politically. Politically, the challenges they might face by being from Iran, which is a country that may be sanctioned by countries like the United States, and having a collaborator from the United States can enhance them, but also the quality of their writing can enhance their ability to get published. And there are many collaborators I've had where all their previous work had been published in very poor quality journals, even though it was high quality work. And I start working with them, collaborating with them publishing with them, and suddenly they're getting published in some of the top journals in their particular fields. To me, that signals there's some kind of problem here beyond just some innate geographic difference that describes a discrepancy in performance research wise. But I do think when we talk about using these models, again, the prompts we use, how we prompt these models is very important. If we say revise something and then we provide them with text and we just have provided the instruction revise this, well, it's going to change a lot of the content and it's going to read very artificial, AI written, and also potentially problematic. The less instruction you provide to AI, the more it's relying on its training data, potential existing sources, plagiarism, those kinds of things. The more direction you can provide on what specifically you want the model to enhance, such as revise the following for clarity and quality, the less the AI is actually being incorporated into there in terms of drawing on existing content. So if you were to take this same prompt here, this same sentence in this example on the right, and tell ChatGPT to just revise it, it would rewrite it completely. And if you put that into like a GPT checker, it's going to say that this is AI written. If you put the prompt revise the following just for clarity and quality, and you put that sentence in there, it will revise it, and what comes out will not be identified as AI written because it's really not AI written. It's AI revised, enhanced, improved to read more clearly. In the same way we use grammar check in Microsoft Word, or we use Grammarly to enhance what is written. One of the really exciting uses of AI within the academic writing process, in my opinion, is using AI for data analysis. So one of the barriers that even I faced coming from a very small university in the United States was we did not have access to statistical packages like SPSS. Even for my dissertation work, I had to get a grant to access different quantitative and qualitative analysis packages. GPT, for instance, these large language models can do all of this analysis for us. It's very good at identifying patterns. But beyond just that, it explains what it's doing as it's doing it. So if I were to perform an analysis in SPSS, I don't just need to collect the result. I need to be able to understand how it got to those results so I can explain it in my manuscript. If I have a tool like ChatGPT that's going to explain to me how it came to this result, then I can learn more about how it got to that point, and I can then use that to teach you in my manuscript how we get to that point. Now, there are limitations, there are gaps. AI models are not always correct. They can hallucinate, they can cause issues. So I don't think that it should completely replace the analysis that you yourself perform, particularly when we talk about qualitative analysis. And it can certainly perform qualitative analysis as well. If you provide it your code book and you provide it some text, it can help code and arrange. But I would strongly advise or caution that you don't want that to replace your coder 1 and coder 2. So if I've used ChatGPT for qualitative analysis, which I have in one study I've published, I have also still included the traditional coder 1, coder 2 for doing the coding as well. In that case, the large language model essentially serves as coder 3, and the idea is to enhance rigor by having that additional coder, that additional non-biased coder who's not affiliated with the project necessarily, and comparing their codes and how they code the data to the two researchers who were involved in coding the data. Same thing with quantitative analysis. I'd always check the results against another software or another calculation that you perform, but the descriptions, the analyses, the detail that it can provide describing how everything was calculated can be really helpful for informing how you might want to describe to your readers how these results are calculated. Again, as I said, prompting is critical with any of this. And so I think as we aim to maybe incorporate generative AI more, one of the issues that we really need to think about is how are we prompting, how are we interacting with these models? you may have seen that there have been more retracted articles this year than any time in human history, in the history of academia. There have been more retracted articles. And I think to a large extent, these are papers that are being written from scratch by AI or are largely written by AI with little human input or oversight. And at the same time are not being disclosed, the AI use in the preparation of these manuscripts. I know of one journal in particular, which I won't name because I do like the journal, but they've had over a dozen papers retracted in the most recent couple of months here because the papers were completely written by AI, had fictitious references, and AI was doing so much of the work there. The researchers were not doing work; they were essentially cheating the system, and it was identified. And so those articles ended up being retracted because they were not publishing quality information. They were publishing fictitious references. They were publishing faulty information. So those papers had to be retracted. But as I said, if you can use it as a tool the same way we use the tools embedded in Microsoft Word, the same way we use Grammarly, then I think that's where it goes from being a potential major ethical issue, major violation, to being something that can just level the playing field. That my collaborators that I've had, where I've had to help rewrite a paper for them so that it could get published in a top journal, maybe they can just say, ChatGPT, help me write this so that it reads at an academic level using the particular terminology and writing style that is preferred by US and UK major publishers. Because often it may not even be the quality of writing itself, that there's grammatical errors and those kinds of things. It may just be that the expectations for section headings and how long paragraphs should be and those kinds of things are the difference between a paper being accepted or not when you think about the role of the reviewers and who is being asked to review certain manuscripts and those kinds of things. On that note, I also want to talk a little bit about how I think generative AI can be used for supporting the reviewing and editing process. Now, I think the peer review system in academia today is broken. It's highly problematic. So I just looked. I have 8 papers that are either currently under review or received a final decision in the last 2 months. The average time of review for those papers was 121 days. The minimum was 56 days, and the maximum, which is still under review, is 252 days. So the average time I've spent waiting on a decision is at least 4 months. And often, even when I do receive reviews, they are of quite poor quality. So I received 8 reviews in the past 2 months. Of those 8 reviews, only if I were to rate on a scale of 0 to 10, I would probably only say 2 of those 8 reviews would receive a score above 5. And that has nothing to do about whether it was a positive review or not. I'm just referring to in terms of the quality of the review. Did they understand what my paper was actually about? Did they provide meaningful feedback? Or is it just one sentence that says, this paper did a good job, or this paper didn't think about this concept, so reject or accept? The quality of reviews has diminished significantly. Again, as with writing a paper, I do not think AI should supplant the role of the reviewer. We need to have human eyes on papers, and we need to have that kind of critical and domain-specific analysis of the quality of the topic. But let's reduce the load on peer reviewers by having AI check some of those extra things that are outside of, does this fit within the domain scope of what we're submitting this paper to, this journal? And does it make logical sense? That should be the role of the domain expert. And let's leave things like, is the paper well written? Does it meet the word length restrictions? Does it have plagiarism issues? Let's leave those questions to something that can be more automated. And so now we're asking less of our reviewers. We're not giving them a list of 20 different criteria to evaluate the paper on. We're saying, look at this paper. Does it fit the scope of this journal? Does it is it logically sound? And that is what you're reviewing on, not all of these additional things. I receive so many reviews nowadays, or see so many reviews that are don't ever mention those aspects, the scope fit or the how logically sound, but they focus on things like, oh, you didn't format the references correctly, or oh, the journal stipulates that needs to be between 5,000 and 7,000 words, and yours is 7,500 words. That does not need to be within the scope of what the reviewer is doing. So I think AI could really help in that regard, being incorporated into that process. Then looking at copy editing, same thing when you reach that point as well. Some journals do that process very quick. The publisher MDPI is particularly well known for having a basically 1 day turnaround between when a paper is accepted and when it's published. But I also have experienced a lot of journals where the process will take months between when you have your paper accepted and when that actually shows up in the journal. And again, when we're talking about the publish and perish cycle, when we're talking about tenure track positions and you only having a certain number of years to show that you're publishing sufficiently, when we're talking about having annual reviews that are contingent on how many publications you have, waiting an average of 121 days, 4 months for the review, just the first round review, by the way, and then another 2 months for copy editing. Well, that's half a year right there that it's just been spent sitting with a journal. So anything to speed up that process by identifying, again, you want human eyes at all stages looking at this paper, but can AI help identify obvious mistakes and speed up that process so that we're not paying somebody just to do a spell check? Those kinds of things would significantly speed up the process. But again, we always have to think about the drawbacks with this. Does it introduce potential bias? We don't want AI doing too much. That's why I say keep human eyes on the AI models at all times, what it's doing, and make sure that there's not this bias creeping into that process of revising, changing the meaning of words, changing the context of what's being said is very important as well. So let's talk about, on that note, some of the issues with authorship and in particularly model training. So you may have heard all these potential biases before if you've listened to any lecture or read about AI bias, but training bias, what are we using to train these models? These models learn from the training data that you're feeding into them, and they're going to use that when you ask it to perform a task in order to draw on that knowledge base and perform the task. Same thing with algorithmic bias. That's focused on how are we designing the algorithm to utilize this data to actually perform tasks. And so with both of those two processes, it's really focused on this black box concept right now. If we use a model like GPT that's behind ChatGPT, we don't know what it's being trained on. We don't know how the model's designed. It's a proprietary model, so we cannot completely determine whether there's going to be issues with training bias or algorithmic bias. And so maybe the solution ultimately is we have to create our own large language models within academia that can perform tasks that are transparent so we know what the model was trained on and can better understand what biases occur. In addition, we have some biases with confirmation bias and limited data bias that can also emerge in the interaction with the model and in the training of the model. So when we're talking about very specific, new emerging topics, very original and creative research, we may reach a point where it goes beyond the knowledge, the training of the model. So if we're talking about a completely new finding, and maybe that finding contradicts established knowledge, then obviously the model might just say, well, this is false, this isn't true, and so I'm not going to write this. I'm going to completely revise, I'm going to completely eliminate what the author found, what they fed into the model, because it's not consistent with what I was trained on being true. And so having those potential biases in the actual interaction with the model and we might feed into the model when we're prompting it to write something is another issue that we as users potentially of these models have to think about as well. So currently we're kind of in a wild west when it comes to AI models in general and when they're used for these specific purposes as well. And that's expected. If you go back and you read articles, you look through a database that articles written in 1994, 1995 about the internet, it's described in the same terms, a wild west. There's no regulation. There's so little understanding of how the internet actually works. And in some ways it's still like that, and in some ways it's improved significantly. So it really comes down to, will government see the need to step in? Will different entities see the need to enforce policy to help rein in and control how these models are being used, how transparent they are, those kinds of things? I think it's very critical as academics, as people talking about these topics, to try to insert ourselves into discussions about the need for regulations, understanding, interacting on a daily basis with future professionals and seeing how they use these models, interacting at the level of scholarly publishing and seeing how it can positively but also negatively impact that realm. Are we going to work with publishers to try to establish some kind of policy? Are we going to work with certain model developers to try to develop some kind of model that's specific to the needs of academia and can be better regulated? Or are we kind of just going to sit on the sideline and see what happens? I think we need to be proactive about saying, these are our needs, these are what we are observing, and be involved in these discussions, because they're just starting now. We still have the opportunity to get involved if we seek out different discussions and debates on these topics, different activities going on our college campuses. I think there was one even mentioned in the chat a little bit ago, but get involved in those discussions. And don't worry if you don't know the technical details of how AI works. That's one of the biggest concerns I'm seeing right now from people from a social science standpoint when I talk to them about AI, is they say, oh, I don't know how to create an algorithm. I don't know how AI works. But you do know people. You are a social scientist. You know how people interact with new tools. You know the importance of human dignity, of human rights, and you know how these technologies could transform people, how certain policies could impact people. So be involved from that standpoint. Admit what you don't know, but stress and advocate for what you do know about human rights, human dignity, and their role in this whole conversation. So last couple slides here. Transparency. Of all the different aspects of AI that I think are critical, of which there are many, I think transparency may be the most important. And we really severely lack transparency, as I mentioned. We have a black box situation. Do we know how ChatGPT is created, the GPT models, how they're created, what data they're being trained on? Is it copyrighted data? These are very critical questions to understanding these models, understanding our rights and whether our rights are being violated and whether we are being ethical when we use these models. Fortunately, there are some different policies and standards and legislation that is being proposed that we can consider. So the International Standards Organization recently published a standard on trustworthiness in AI that has a whole section on transparency standards. So I would, as an academic, encourage other academics to familiarize themselves with that policy and encourage others to do the same. These provide some guidelines for how we should be designing AI models. And again, as social scientists, maybe we don't understand all the ins and outs, the technical aspects of how the AI model works. But if in our classes, if we have undergraduates who are in that technical background, if we could insert some discussion about policy, about the topic of transparency, into our discussions and how it impacts humans and how it impacts human rights, well, that might be something that sticks with them when they go out and do become professionals. We have CLEAR, which is a kind of a consortium of leaders in academia and industry who have developed a policy and documentation framework to encourage AI transparency. And in the United States, I'm unfortunately not familiar with the current status of different legislation in Canada, but in the United States, we do have the Research, Innovation, and Accountability Act, which is currently kind of under debate and discussion. And that's a bipartisan legislation, which is very rare in this day and age, that is encouraging or really demanding, requiring that developers of AI models across the spectrum on an annual basis disclose the design behind their models, what training data they're using. That might not be made available to the public as a whole, but it's at least would have to be made available to a regulatory oversight committee within Congress that could then review and make sure nothing highly unethical is occurring. And so these are very positive steps. I'm hoping that these will be expanded upon, and I'm hoping these are also things that you might be interested in reading more about and stressing in some of your courses when you might have the opportunity to talk to people about AI and how it can impact these different areas. Last thing here, let's be involved in training the future authors, future academics, and our students about AI. So again, you don't have to be an expert on the technical aspects of AI in order to be able to talk about the role of AI within academic integrity, within scholarly publishing, within how are you finding your course instructors' policies about AI. A really great potential opportunity is with micro-credentials. I was involved in creating a micro-credential for my university. I'm actually going to, as soon as I'm done here, drive to campus and talk about this to some people on campus. At another presentation, I was able to create this, how can you use AI fundamentals micro-credential. And the purpose of this micro-credential, I'm not talking about how AI works. We actually have somebody from data science talking about that aspect, but I'm talking about understanding how academic integrity policies apply to AI usage. So we all have academic integrity policies. Most of them aren't going to specifically mention AI. And the reason for that is depending on the discipline, depending on the context, you might use AI to different degrees. So I mentioned today, this is what I think is permissible as far as the extent of using AI for scholarly publishing. If you're a data scientist, though, I know a lot of data scientists in my department, they can use AI pretty much as they want to help them develop new algorithms, new models to help analyze data. That's not considered unethical necessarily. And so it can vary from department to department, but our academic integrity policy states that the unauthorized use of any tool in promoting or producing your assignments is an academic integrity violation. So simply as an instructor, if you say, I do not allow you to use generative AI in this class, then that is an academic integrity violation if they use generative AI in the class. So just letting students know that it doesn't have to specifically say AI in the policy for it to apply can be very enlightening for them. Talking about the basics of prompt engineering. So how do you interact with a model? Well, it can be very similar to interacting with a search engine, and you want to critically evaluate what you get, the results. They're not always trustworthy and reliable. So approach it from the perspective of information literacy, which is something that libraries already provide, information literacy instruction. Does this pass the smell test? Does this make sense? Or is something off, something wrong here? And if it is, go validate against another source. None of that requires expertise in how a model works. And although I could tell you how a large language model works and how we train them, it's not really relevant or germane to what these students need to know or want to know in order to be successful navigating the infrastructure of a university campus or the scholarly publishing infrastructure as well. So just to wrap up here, I think these AI models have a lot of great potential, and I want to encourage you to explore them. If you haven't for whatever reason, they are not going away, obviously. So it's the best advice I think is to explore them, see how they can be used to make you more successful, make other people more successful, and to see them as a tool. And ultimately, they're just the next phase, the next step in evolution that included things like Microsoft Word's embedded features, that included things like Grammarly, that included search engines. Each of those steps really dramatically changed things in how we looked at scholarly publishing, at how we looked at higher education. But we were okay on the other side. It took some time to adjust. We're okay on the other side. This is just another step in the evolution. It's not something brand new out of nowhere. We can address this. We can deal with this. We can incorporate this and improve what we do. But at the same time, we need to understand this is a new technology. These are new emerging models, and there are a lot we don't understand about them. So we shouldn't be full on embracing everything with an uncritical eye, uncritical mind. We need to be extremely critical while we're using it. So the fact that we're using these technologies, that we're thinking about the positive uses of them, should not assuage our concerns, and they should in fact encourage us to think even more about potential possibilities and concerns and communicate those to relevant stakeholders. And then consider that the current models are just a step, again, in a long series of evolution. And so we're seeing when ChatGPT was first made available, which was less than 2 years ago, they used the GPT-3 model. We have now gone on to 5 different iterations and improvements on that original model. And it just gets more and more complex. Now we have multimodal large language models in which you could feed something like a figure or a chart that you've created into ChatGPT, and it can create a description of what that figure or chart or map is about. And so it's only getting more and more complex in what it can do. So don't stop at one point just satisfied with what you've understood about these models, but continue to be forward looking about how you can continue to incorporate them in your work and what changes might occur in the future. So these are just a select few of my references, some of my papers, some of papers that were highly influential in better understanding these topics as they were first emerging. So that's just a spattering of different resources there that you might be interested in checking out. And I would really like to thank you for joining me today, listening to my little talk, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions that you have for me.
Thank you so much, Brady. All right, we will open this up for questions. While people are thinking, I will jump in with one, which is, so we actually used ChatGPT in helping to select speakers for this series. Because it's a complex thing, the sort of range of journals and disciplines and who's doing interesting methods is not an easy thing to be able to pull out of sort of standard journal databases. What was interesting in doing it was, it was the first time that I had a real experience of the hallucination. And my job changed fundamentally from being the person who sort of reading abstracts and deciding whether they're worth attention to validating that, okay, yes, this is a real article. Yes, this does actually meet the criteria that we set up. Okay, and now I'm going to read it. And so it's interesting because what we found in this just one example was that it expanded the range of what we found, but it made the work actually a little more painful.
Yeah,
and I've
absolutely.
Heard similar anecdotes from others. So I'm curious. I don't know. Is that a real thing, or is that just my experience?
Yeah, that kind of goes back to what I was talking about kind of with this little parabola figure here. I think the more you rely on AI, ultimately the more work you may end up doing. But there are some real benefits at the same time of using AI in the way you said, because we get to understand, or we get to look beyond the set of sources that we're familiar with to find the actual articles, the actual authors who are really doing some interesting things in these areas. If we rely on the historical approach of just looking at for instance, the top journals or the journals we're familiar with, there may be authors, especially in this day and age when there's so many journals out there on so many different topics, so many people in different disciplines, highly interdisciplinary, that it's very easy to miss someone doing really interesting work. And again, that fundamental problem of as well of the barriers for potential researchers from the global south, and are they contributing something really interesting but it's not being published in a top journal you're familiar with. Well, maybe that criteria isn't as important to a model like ChatGPT. So when you ask it what are some innovative recent articles on this topic, it's not going to say, oh well, this was in this journal that I like, so I'm gonna recommend it. It's going to recommend, hopefully, what are the most relevant articles to that particular topic you were prompting it about. So definitely some issues where it could actually create more work, and that's why when people would approach me with the idea of like AI replacing their job, I'm like, I don't know. As far as I've used AI, it's made my work a lot more intense and in some ways more difficult. But at the same time, it makes it more enriching, and it makes you think in new ways. And I think that's really the great thing and the beneficial thing about this technology.
Other comments or questions? Feel free to just unmute or put it in chat. Gary?
Hi, so I can't see how to.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Okay.
Sorry.
Yes, we can hear you
I'll
now.
start again. Yeah, I've experimented with using ChatGPT for like proofreading emails I'm going to send and informal stuff like that. I'm worried about pasting actual stuff I'm thinking of publishing in, because even though it's going to make life easier by just grammar checking and doing punctuation, I'm worried about, well, where does this thing go to? And then is somebody going to like say, well, you must have used this to generate the article, when all I've done is used it to spell check like I would use Grammarly?
Right.
Is that a valid concern? Or
Yes, that's a very valid concern. And what I would encourage, so there are multiple versions of ChatGPT actually. The free version, I would not encourage you to enter things into it. If you look at the policy for OpenAI, the creator of ChatGPT, it will tell you, they use your prompts to train the model. And so there is a decent chance that if you were to enter something into that free version of ChatGPT, it may end up becoming training data for a future version of the model. And that's true of a lot of the models. Even with Google's Gemini model, anything you search on Google can become part of the training data. So that is definitely a concern with the free version of models. Now, what ChatGPT does have available is you can subscribe. I think it's $20 a month. And then you can take the basic ChatGPT model and you can create your own GPTs. You can specially train them. And when you do that, you're basically taking the actual model and you're creating a fork of it and you're creating your own thing. And so whatever you enter, it remains in your possession. So you can take it, you could feed your own data, train a model for your own specific purposes. And that's going to be your model. It's not going to be available to other people. And so if you are willing to pay that $20 a month or whatever, then you could potentially have that model where you're not going to have those same concerns. Of course, that brings the question of when we're talking about like researchers in the global south, can they afford $20 a month, access considerations, those kinds of things. But when it comes to privacy, it's going to be better if you can use one of those subscription models rather than the public ChatGPT. I will say, not in the realm of scholarly publishing, but just within my classes, I see a lot of students who are just feeding my same exact assignment instructions into ChatGPT. And when they do that, they get the same exact responses. And so even if I couldn't identify that they used AI, I can identify that they plagiarized because my same prompt has been fed, my same instructions have been fed into ChatGPT so much, it provides the same exact responses. So yeah, there are definitely reasons to be concerned about using the public available version of models. And I would encourage, though, exploring subscribing to some model and getting a private model that you could then use for whatever purposes you want to use it for, which is what I tend to do.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
I'm curious, you mentioned the that you do in teaching students about AI. Do you find that there are some sort of common misunderstandings or concerns amongst current undergraduate or even graduate students around AI? Or in many cases, are they teaching new things?
There are some common misunderstandings. So a little more background on this micro-credential. This was about a year-long process. So we started when ChatGPT first launched to begin to create this. And we use the Canvas learning management system, and we just create it within that. So you can basically set up a course shell, and you just create a short version of a course. And at this point, we've had over 1,000 students sign up for this, just my particular section of this micro-credential. And the common theme that I see is just a misunderstanding of the extent to which students believe that AI is permissible in their work, and also the extent to which they believe they can get away with using it. That academic integrity aspect, because universities are so reluctant to mention AI specifically in their policy. Just within my department, we have some people in library science who do not allow AI for any use in their class. And we have some data scientists who basically allow free use of AI to help develop models and things. And so just within our department, we can't even have a consistent AI policy because we have different beliefs on how AI should be used. So it was very important within a module of this micro-credential that is receiving very good feedback to stress the fact that these policies are on a class by class basis, not even instructor by instructor, because I might teach a class in different discipline areas, but a class by class basis. And you either need to check the policy in the syllabus as to how AI can be used, or if there happen to not be a syllabus policy about AI, then you need to ask the instructor. It's never just you can use AI as long as there's nothing said about it. It's always, if it's not mentioned, you need to check with the instructor. And the instructor ultimately gets to decide if that's a permissible technology to use or not. If you use AI and you're caught, even if the instructor did not explicitly prohibit it in their syllabus, if they've caught you using AI and they say they don't permit using AI, then you can go under all the same academic integrity punishments and policies, procedures, as if you were blatantly plagiarizing. And so that is a common area where students don't seem to have understood that. We're finding, at least here in the United States and Texas, that a lot of students were very rampantly using AI to help them on various assignments as high schoolers. And so we're having to educate them on what is permissible and acceptable at our university. And so those are the main issues where this micro-credential seems to be helping. And we've tried, our goal was to get this incorporated as something that students would be asked to complete as part of undergraduate introductory courses, so that they would get exposure to this during hopefully their first semester at the university.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lund, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.